The golden chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling of the Grand Hotel ballroom sparkled like 1,000 frozen stars. Below them, the room was buzzing with the low hum of expensive conversation. It was the kind of night where people didn't just come to eat. They came to be seen. The women wore long, shimmering dresses that caught the light with every step, and the men were in crisp black suits that probably cost more than some people earned in a year. The air smelled rich, a mix of expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and the faint scent of polished wood. In the center of this luxury stood a large black piano. It was the centerpiece of the room. Sitting on the bench was Julian. Julian was a famous pianist, known all over the country for his fast fingers and his perfect playing. He looked like he belonged on a movie poster. His hair was perfectly styled, his suit was tailored to fit his frame exactly, and he held himself with a kind of proud posture that dared anyone to look away. He was playing a difficult classical piece, his hands moving up and down the keys with incredible speed. He hit the notes hard, making the music sound dramatic and powerful. Every time he finished a difficult section, he would look up at the crowd with a small smile, as if waiting for them to applaud. The guests loved it. They stood around the piano with glasses of champagne in their hands, nodding their heads and whispering about how talented he was. To them, the music was just background noise for their party, but they enjoyed the show of it all. However, not everyone in the room was there to drink champagne and clap. Over in the far corner of the ballroom, near the heavy velvet curtains, stood Maria. She was a maid at the hotel, and she had been working for hours already. Her feet were tired, and her back ached, but she kept a smile on her face. She wore the standard black and white uniform that the hotel provided for the staff. It was simple and clean, but compared to the silk and satin worn by the guests, she felt invisible. She was there to make sure the empty glasses were cleared away and that the guests had everything they needed. Tonight, she had an extra helper. Standing next to her was her son, Matteo. Matteo was 15 years old. He wasn't supposed to be working such a late event on a school night, but the family needed the extra money. He wore a uniform too, though it was a little too big for him. The sleeves of his white shirt were just a bit too long, covering his wrists, and the black vest hung loosely on his thin frame. He held a silver tray in his hands, collecting used napkins and empty glasses from the high tables near the walls. While the other guests laughed and talked about their vacations and their new cars, Matteo watched the piano. He couldn't help it. The music seemed to pull at him, ignoring the noise of the crowd. He watched Julian's hands closely. He saw the way the pianist's fingers danced across the black and white keys. To the rich people in the room, Julian looked perfect. They saw a master at work. But Matteo saw something different. He had been playing music since he was a little boy, mostly on a broken old keyboard at home. He knew what the music was supposed to feel like. As he stood there in the corner, balancing the tray, he noticed that Julian was fast. Yes, but there was something missing. The notes were there, but the feeling wasn't. It sounded like a machine playing. Perfect and cold, without any heart. Matteo shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to stay out of the way. He didn't want to be noticed by the guests. He knew that people sometimes got uncomfortable when they saw a teenager working at a fancy party. He just wanted to do his job, help his mother, and maybe, if he was lucky, steal a few more glances at the piano. The lights were bright, the room was loud, and the music was swelling to a loud finish. Matteo watched Julian hit the final keys of the song, letting the sound ring out through the hall. The guests clapped politely, raising their glasses. Julian stood up and took a bow, looking very pleased with himself. Matteo stayed in the shadows, holding his tray, feeling a strange mix of admiration and frustration. He knew he could play it better. He knew he could put the soul into it that Julian was missing. But for now, he was just the maid's son, invisible in the corner, waiting for the next guest to drop a napkin. The last note of the song faded away, and the room filled with the sound of polite clapping. Julian stood up, smoothing his expensive suit, and took a deep bow. He looked out at the crowd with a smile that said he knew exactly how good he was. The guests smiled back, enjoying the performance. It was a perfect moment for them, a night of class and culture. Julian gestured toward the side of the room, signaling that he needed a glass of water to cool down. Maria saw the signal from across the room. She quickly picked up a clean glass from a side table and filled it with cold water. She walked carefully toward the piano, trying not to bump into anyone. She was tired, and her hands were slightly damp from washing dishes earlier, but she moved with care. As she reached the piano, she leaned forward to place the glass on the small stand near the keys. Just as she set the glass down, her elbow accidentally tapped the leg of the heavy piano. It wasn't a hard hit, but the piano was sensitive to every vibration. A dull, jarring thud echoed through the ballroom, cutting through the silence just as the applause was dying down. It wasn't loud, but in such a fancy and quiet room, it sounded like a thunderclap. Julian froze. He slowly turned his head to look at the source of the noise. When he saw Maria standing there, looking nervous, his face turned red with anger. The calm, polite artist disappeared in an instant, replaced by a cruel look of disgust. "Careful," Julian snapped, his voice sharp and loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "Do you have any idea what you are doing? Some of us are trying to create art here, not clean up messes." Maria quickly pulled her hands back, her face flushing bright red. "I am so sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice shaking. It was an accident. The guests nearby stopped talking. They turned to look at Maria. Some looked annoyed that the mood was ruined, while others just looked awkward. Maria felt small under their gaze. She kept her head down, wishing she could disappear into the carpet. She grabbed her cleaning cloth and turned to leave, feeling the tears stinging her eyes. But Matteo had seen everything. He was standing only a few feet away, holding a tray of empty glasses. When he saw the way the famous pianist had spoken to his mother, he felt a sudden heat rise in his chest. He saw his mother's shoulders shaking and the look of shame on her face. He couldn't just stand there and watch her be treated like dirt, especially not by someone who was supposed to be a gentleman, without thinking about the consequences. Matteo stepped forward. He left his spot against the wall and walked right up to the edge of the piano platform. He was just a teenage boy in a baggy uniform, looking up at a wealthy, famous musician, but he didn't back down. "She didn't mean to do it," Matteo said. His voice was steady, louder than he intended. "And besides, you missed the G-sharp in the second measure." It was flat. The room went deadly silent. You could hear a pin drop. People gasped. A maid's son, a teenager in a waiter's uniform, was criticizing the great pianist. It was something that simply wasn't done. The guests looked at Matteo with wide eyes, shocked by his bravery or his stupidity. Julian stared at the boy. For a second he looked confused, as if he couldn't believe his ears. Then a sneer slowly spread across his face. He looked Matteo up and down, taking in the cheap uniform, the messy sleeves, and the tray in his hands. "Excuse me?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You, a busboy, are going to critique my performance?" He laughed, a short, mocking sound that made a few people in the crowd chuckle nervously. Julian turned to the audience, waving a hand at Matteo like he was showing them a funny joke. "Listen to this. I doubt you even know where middle C is, let alone how to critique a concerto. Why don't you run along and fill the water glasses?" The crowd laughed again, but Matteo didn't move. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on Julian's. He knew what he heard. He knew the mistake was real. The laughter from the guests echoed in Matteo's ears, but he didn't look away from the piano. He kept his eyes on Julian, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs. The pianist was leaning back against the piano, looking very pleased with himself. He thought he had one. He thought he had silenced the help with a joke. The room was buzzing with whispers now. People were looking at Matteo with pity, or worse, with annoyance that a waiter was interrupting their evening. Julian looked down at Matteo, a cruel smile still playing on his lips. "Well," Julian asked, raising an eyebrow, "cat got your tongue? Or are you realizing that you have no idea what you are talking about?" Matteo took a deep breath. He felt the weight of the uniform on his shoulders, the cheap fabric itching against his skin. He glanced at his mother, Maria. She was standing a few steps behind him, her hands clasped together tightly. Her eyes were wide with fear. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for him. She knew how these events worked. She knew that if her son caused a scene, they could both lose their jobs. She gave him a tiny, almost invisible shake of her head, pleading with him to just walk away. But Matteo couldn't walk away. He knew that if he walked away now, Julian would always be the winner. He would go back to his life thinking he was better than everyone else, thinking he could treat people like garbage just because they wore different clothes. Matteo looked back at the piano. The black and white keys seemed to shine under the lights, calling to him. He knew he could play. He knew he could prove it. "I'm not wrong," Matteo said, his voice clear and strong. It wasn't a shout, but it cut through the whispers. The note was flat. It ruined the flow. The room went quiet again, but this time it was a tense silence. Julian stopped smiling. He stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at the boy as if he was a pest that needed to be swatted away. Julian glanced at the crowd of guests, looking for support. They were all watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The drama was more entertaining than the music had been. "You have a lot of nerve for a boy holding a tray," Julian said coldly. He turned to face the room fully. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a brave young critic among us." He waved his hand toward the empty bench. "Since you seem to know so much about the music, perhaps you would like to show us how it should be done. Or are you just going to stand there and insult a professional?" The guests murmured. Some of them shook their heads, thinking that Julian was being too harsh, but no one stepped in to stop him. They wanted to see the show. They expected Matteo to panic. They expected him to apologize and run back to the kitchen. A 15-year-old waiter challenging a master pianist? It was a joke. They were waiting for the punchline. Matteo looked at the bench. It looked so small compared to the giant piano. He looked down at his own hands. They were rough from washing dishes and helping his mother with cleaning, but they were his hands. He felt a sudden calm wash over him. He realized he had nothing left to lose. If he walked away, he would regret it forever. "Okay," Matteo said. Julian's mouth fell open slightly. He hadn't expected that. "Excuse me?" Julian asked. "I will play," Matteo said. He reached out and set his tray down on a nearby table with a deliberate clink. The sound signaled that he wasn't a waiter anymore. He was a person stepping into the ring. Maria let out a small gasp. "Matteo, no," she whispered, stepping forward. "Please don't do this." Matteo turned to her and gave her a gentle look. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly. "Trust me." He turned back to the piano and walked toward it. The crowd parted to let him through. It felt like walking through the ocean. He could feel their eyes burning into his back. He could hear their breathing. They were waiting for him to fail. They wanted him to embarrass himself so they could go back to their drinks and forget about him. When Matteo reached the piano, he didn't sit down immediately. He stood there for a moment, looking at the instrument. It was a beautiful Steinway, worth more money than his family would see in a lifetime. He reached out and touched the smooth wood gently. He could feel the vibration of the room in it. He adjusted the bench, moving it slightly to the left. He checked the height. The way his teacher had taught him years ago on that old keyboard in their living room, Julian was standing off to the side, looking amused. "Take your time," Julian sneered. "Don't let stage fright hit you too hard." Matteo ignored him. He sat down on the bench. It felt firm and comfortable. He flexed his fingers, shaking them out to get the blood flowing. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with air. The laughter and the whispers faded into the background. For the first time all night, Matteo felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He wasn't a waiter anymore. He was a pianist. Matteo sat on the bench, his back straight, looking at the rows of black and white keys. The ballroom was packed with people, but it felt strangely quiet. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting. They expected him to place his hands on the keys and fumble. They expected a clumsy, discordant noise that would make them cringe and laugh. Julian stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, looking at his watch as if he were already bored. But Matteo didn't put his hands on the keys yet. Instead, he leaned forward. Sitting on the music rack was a large, heavy book of sheet music. It was open to a complex page, filled with notes so tiny they looked like ants. Most people believed that playing the piano was about reading these notes perfectly. Julian certainly thought so. Matteo reached out and closed the book. The sound was soft, but in the silence, it seemed like a door slamming. Then he did something that made the crowd gasp. He grabbed the heavy book, lifted it off the rack, and dropped it onto the floor beside him. Thud. The sound echoed through the room. It was a bold move. It was disrespectful to some, shocking to others. Julian's jaw dropped. "What are you doing?" he sputtered. "You can't play that without music." Matteo ignored him. He reached up and rubbed his hands together briskly, warming the skin. He cracked his knuckles, one by one. Pop. Pop. The sound was sharp and confident. He wasn't checking a cheat sheet. He wasn't asking for help. He was preparing to speak the only language he truly loved. He closed his eyes for a brief second, listening to the silence inside his head. Then he opened his eyes, placed his hands on the keys, and let them drop. The sound that exploded from the piano wasn't a beginner's mistake. It was a thunderstorm. Matteo launched into the music with a speed and power that made the air in the room vibrate. He was playing La Campanella, a piece famously difficult, known for jumping notes and terrifying speed. For the first 10 seconds, nobody moved. They were frozen in shock. The boy in the baggy uniform wasn't struggling. His fingers were flying across the keys faster than the eye could follow. His left hand jumped across the octaves with perfect accuracy, hitting notes that most experienced pianists avoided. He wasn't just reading music. He was attacking the piano with a fierce, joyful energy. Julian's smirk vanished instantly. His face went pale. He took a step closer to the piano, his eyes wide. He knew the piece Matteo was playing. He knew how hard it was. He could see that Matteo was hitting every note, every trill, every run without a single mistake. But it wasn't just the speed. It was the sound. Julian played with technical perfection, like a machine. Matteo played with soul. The music seemed to pour out of him, rising and falling like a wave. It was angry in some parts, gentle in others, but it was alive. The guests stopped whispering. Their drinks went untasted. The wealthy women in silk dresses lowered their phones, their mouths open in surprise. The man in the expensive suit stopped checking his watch. They were witnessing something impossible. A maid's son, a kid they had ignored all night, was creating magic on the instrument. Matteo's body swayed with the music. He didn't look stiff like Julian. He moved naturally, leaning into the hard parts and pulling back for the soft ones. He wasn't thinking about the people watching. He wasn't thinking about the uniform or the money. He was lost in the music. He was showing them, without using a single word, that art isn't about who you are or what you wear. It is about what you have inside you. As he flew through the hardest section of the song, his hands became a blur. The notes cascaded down like rain, clear and bright. He hit the final powerful chords with such force that he almost lifted off the bench. He held the last note, letting it ring out into the stunned silence of the room, his hands hovering over the keys, his chest heaving slightly from the effort. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look for applause. He just sat there for a moment, coming back to reality, his hands resting softly on the keys that had just spoken for him. For a few seconds after the last note faded, the huge ballroom was completely silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air is holding its breath. The guests stood frozen, their glasses halfway to their lips, their eyes fixed on the boy in the oversized uniform. They had come expecting a comedy show, a clumsy waiter making a fool of himself. Instead, they had just witnessed something that didn't seem possible. A 15-year-old boy, who they had ignored all night, had just played with more passion and skill than the famous pianist they had paid to see. Then, a single sound broke the quiet. An older man sitting near the front slowly stood up and began to clap. His applause was steady and respectful. It wasn't the polite clapping people give out of habit. It was real. Within moments, the rest of the room joined in. The clapping grew louder and louder, turning into a roar that bounced off the high ceiling. People started cheering. Some of the guests were so surprised that they forgot to be sophisticated. They were whistling and shouting, "Bravo." Julian stood near the piano, his face pale and his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The smirk was gone, wiped away by the reality of what had just happened. He watched the crowd cheering for Matteo, and for the first time that night he looked small. He knew that he had been outplayed. He realized that while he had perfect technique, the boy had something he couldn't buy with money or learn from a teacher: a soul for the music. Julian slowly backed away from the piano, fading into the background, ignored by the very people who had been admiring him just minutes before. Matteo sat on the bench for a moment longer, looking down at the keys. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a sudden shyness. He wasn't a famous performer seeking glory. He was just a kid who loved music. He stood up from the bench, smoothing down the front of his vest. The cheering grew even louder as he stood, but he didn't bow like a star. He didn't wave to the crowd. He simply gave a small, nervous nod to the room and quickly walked away from the spotlight. He walked straight to the corner, where his mother was standing. Maria had her hands covering her mouth, and tears were streaming down her face. Her son, the boy she worked so hard to support, had just stood up to a powerful man and won. She wasn't just crying because he played well. She was crying because she was so incredibly proud of the man he was becoming. Matteo reached her and wrapped his arms around her. The crowd watched, touched by the sight of the mother and son hugging in the corner of the fancy ballroom. "You were amazing," Maria whispered, squeezing him tight. "I always knew it." Matteo smiled, picking up the tray he had left on the table. "Thanks, Mom," he said softly. They didn't stay for the rest of the party. They didn't stay to hear the guests coming up to them, asking where Matteo had learned to play and telling him he should be on stage. They didn't stay to see the hotel manager rushing over, realizing that his maid's son was a hidden gem who might bring fame to his hotel. Matteo and Maria walked out of the ballroom together, leaving the bright lights and the champagne behind. They walked through the quiet corridors of the hotel, past the kitchen, and toward the exit. Outside, the night air was cool and fresh. Matteo took a deep breath. He was still wearing the baggy uniform, and he still had a long walk home, but something felt different. He felt taller. He felt lighter. He had proven to himself and to everyone else that you should never judge a book by its cover, and that true talent doesn't care about money or status. It just shines.